The moment Lydia Harmon leveled her finger at the man in the worn canvas work jacket and said, loud enough for everyone at Petrakis Grill to hear, I need this table and I need it now. So whatever you're doing here, wrap it up. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed wrong. In Millhaven, you understood the weight of that name before you learned long division. The Harmons didn't need to raise their voices. The consequences were always implied. But 2 tables away, near the back wall, where the light came in softer through the old Venetian blinds, a man in his early 70s with thick gray hair and a flannel shirt had been watching the whole thing over the rim of a coffee cup. He set the cup down very slowly, the way a person did when they had made up their mind about something. Then, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a phone that was at least 3 models behind current, and he started scrolling through his contacts. He found the number on the second try. He hadn't called it in 2 years. Reuben Schafer had not planned for any of this. He'd planned for the meatloaf special and a slice of coconut cream pie that Maeve had been talking about since the previous Tuesday. That was the deal they'd made. Honor roll, 2 semesters running, meant she got to pick the restaurant. She'd chosen Petrakis Grill without hesitating, which hadn't surprised him at all. They'd been coming here since she was 6, back when he'd first moved back to Millhaven after Annie died, and he'd needed somewhere that felt like the world was still in one piece. Gus Petrakis kept a booth in the back for them. Not officially, there was no sign, no reservation system in a diner like this, but there was an understanding. Gus ran his place the way his father had taught him to run things, which was to say with the particular loyalty that came from watching someone go through the worst year of their life and keep showing up anyway. Maeve was 10 now. She had Annie's eyes and Reuben's stubbornness, which people in town had pointed out repeatedly was a combustible combination. She had her nose in the laminated menu, with an intensity that suggested the choice between the coconut cream pie and the apple crisp was the most consequential decision currently underway in Millhaven, which, until about 4 minutes ago, it had been. Reuben was on his first cup of coffee. He'd let it go lukewarm because he'd been watching Maeve read, which was something he did more than he probably should. It had started the year Annie got sick, this low-grade, constant monitoring, making sure Maeve was still laughing at the right things, still asking questions the way she used to. She was. Mostly she was. But it was the kind of okay that required tending, and he knew that, and so he watched. He heard the door before he saw who came through it. There was a particular quality to the way Lydia Harmon moved through a room, not loud exactly, but deliberate. She was in her mid-30s, in a blazer the color of wet sand and trousers, with a crease that looked architectural. 2 people trailed behind her. A young woman with a tablet held like a clipboard, and a man in dark clothes who stationed himself near the entrance and scanned the room with the blank efficiency of someone trained to treat every space as a potential problem. Lydia Harmon didn't scan, she assessed. Her eyes moved through the diner with the economy of someone who had spent their whole life walking into rooms and immediately calculating their usefulness. They stopped on the corner booth, on Reuben and Maeve. Becca, the waitress, stepped around the counter. Hi, welcome in. Just so you know, we're running about 15 for seating. I need that table. Lydia's voice was pleasant. That was the first thing Reuben registered. Not raised, not dramatic. Simply certain, the way a fact was certain. Becca blinked. That table's occupied. I can see that. She was already moving toward the back. It won't be for long. Reuben looked up when the heels stopped beside their booth. Maeve was still studying the menu. He registered the blazer, the posture, the way the assistant appeared behind her like a shadow, and something careful settled over him. Excuse me. Lydia looked at him the way you'd look at an obstacle you hadn't anticipated. I need this booth. Reuben set his coffee down. We're in the middle of lunch. How much longer? We just got our drinks. Right. The smile didn't reach her eyes. Here's the situation. I have a photographer coming in 20 minutes for a regional magazine piece. This is the only table with adequate natural light. She gestured at the window behind him. I'm going to need you to move. Becca had come around the counter. I can check if there's another spot. I'm talking to him. Lydia didn't look at Becca. She was watching Reuben with the expression of someone waiting for arithmetic to solve itself. Reuben looked at Maeve. She had put the menu down. Her hands were in her lap now, out of sight, and he knew without seeing them exactly what they were doing, gripping the hem of her sweatshirt the way she did when something was wrong and she'd decided not to say so. That was the thing. That specific thing settled everything for him. "We're going to finish our lunch," he said. "You're welcome to wait at the counter." The pleasant expression changed, not into anger, into something colder and more deliberate. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "Someone who needs a table," Reuben said. "Same as us." Lydia set her hand on the back of the booth. "I'm going to be direct with you, because direct is more efficient than dancing around it." She glanced at his jacket, the canvas one, permanently stained with engine grease no matter how many times he washed it, and then at his hands, at the calluses, at the knuckles that never came fully clean. "I own 3 commercial properties in this county. My family has been in business here for 40 years. The zoning variances that allowed this building to expand its dining room? That was my father's office." She looked at Becca. "Are we understanding each other?" Becca had gone the color of old flour. "I'm not talking to you." Back to Reuben. "I'm talking to him. What's the work? Auto shop? Maintenance?" The man at the next table had set his fork down. Someone near the front had gone quiet mid-sentence. Reuben said nothing for a moment, then, "Maeve, go ahead and pick your dessert." His daughter looked up at him with an expression that was working very hard to stay even. "Dad?" "Circle it, Bug. We've got time." He looked at Lydia Harmon. He looked at her the way he'd learned to look at a seized engine, with patience, with clarity, with no anger at all, because anger didn't fix anything. "We'll be done when we're done," he said. "You're welcome to sit at the counter." Something moved through Lydia Harmon's expression, something that had been sitting under the pleasantness all along, waiting. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Gus Petrakis came out of the kitchen 60 seconds later. He was a large man. He'd played semi-pro basketball in another life and still moved like it, and his apron had flour on it from the morning. He walked to Reuben's table, stood with his arms folded, and said to Lydia Harmon in his careful, accented English, "This table is reserved, has been reserved every other weekend for 5 years. You are welcome at any other table in my restaurant." Lydia looked at him the way she'd look at furniture that had developed an opinion. "I'll remember this establishment," she said. "I hope you do," said Gus. What Reuben didn't see, because he was watching his daughter, was the man in the back corner. Walter Odom was 71 years old. He'd been retired for 3 years and spent that retirement doing 3 things: reading, fishing the creek behind his house on Henley Road, and eating pie at Petrakis Grill on the days the cherry filling was fresh. Nobody in Millhaven knew much beyond that he was quiet and kept a tidy yard and always tipped 25%. What they didn't know, because he'd never mentioned it, and because he'd chosen Millhaven specifically because nobody here would mention it for him, was that Walter Odom had spent 28 years as a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, working out of the Public Integrity Section. He had brought cases against 2 city councils, 1 state treasurer, and 4 separate county development boards in 3 different states. He had the particular stillness of a man who had learned, over decades, that watching carefully was almost always more useful than reacting quickly. He had been watching from the moment Lydia Harmon walked through the door. He recognized the mechanism, not from this woman specifically, he didn't know her, but from years of studying how entitlement expressed itself in rooms where it had never been challenged. The way the staff had contracted, the way Becca had physically made herself smaller, the way the man at the next table had picked up his fork again and was staring at his plate with the focused attention of someone who had decided, very deliberately, not to see anything. That wasn't the reaction of a room encountering someone rude. That was the reaction of a room that had been trained. Walter had a rule he'd kept for 30 years. Never make a call when your chest was still tight. He stood up, folded 4 bills under his coffee cup, and walked outside. He stood on the sidewalk for 2 minutes, watching a pickup truck idle at the crosswalk, watching a kid on a bike navigate around a pothole he'd probably memorized by now. Then he dialed. It rang 3 times. Odom. The voice on the other end was younger than he remembered, though it had only been 3 years. "Thought you were fishing." "I am fishing," Walter said. "Are you recording?" A pause. "Give me a minute." He gave them 90 seconds. Force of habit. Then he told them everything the way he'd learned to tell things. Names, times, direct quotes, where he was confident of accuracy, body language of the staff, the specific quality of the fear he'd observed in a room that had clearly learned to absorb this as routine. He described the zoning comment. He described the look at the jacket. He described the phone call Lydia Harmon had made while keeping her eyes on the man in the booth. The father, Walter said, is not part of any of this. He was there for his daughter's lunch. I want that on record before we go further. Understood. One more thing. I've been looking at the county's zoning approval records for the past 6 weeks, casually. Old habit. There's a pattern in the Harmon family's development contracts that I think your office will find worth examining, if you haven't already. A longer pause. How worth examining? The kind that has a shape, Walter said. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. Reuben didn't know any of that. He was watching Maeve eat coconut cream pie with the focused pleasure of someone who had been anticipating this for 5 days. When they stood to leave, he put enough on the table to cover the meal and a tip that was more than he could comfortably spare, because Becca had tried to hold her ground as much as she'd been able to, and that was worth something. He took Maeve's hand, and they walked toward the door. He hadn't expected what happened next. It started with the older woman near the window. She just started clapping, quiet and deliberate. Then the couple in the middle booth. Then the man who had put down his fork. And then, one by one, nearly everyone in Petrakis Grill was on their feet, not making a production of it. Just standing, clapping, looking at Reuben, with the expression of people who had seen something they recognized, and were glad someone else had seen it too. Maeve gripped his hand very hard. He kept his face still. He nodded once, small, quiet, and walked his daughter out into the gray afternoon. Lydia Harmon was still on her phone near the counter. 3 people at tables nearby had stopped pretending not to watch her. And outside, by the corner of the building, an old man in a flannel shirt was still on his call, speaking in the measured cadence of someone giving a formal statement. The first person Reuben told was nobody. He drove home. He stopped at the hardware store for weather stripping he'd been putting off. He helped Maeve with a book report due Thursday. He heated soup from a can because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays were not ambitious, and they ate it at the kitchen table while Maeve debated the comparative intelligence of dolphins versus dogs with a certainty that suggested she had already reached a verdict and was performing the debate as a formality. His sister Carol texted at 8:30, heard about Petrakis. You okay? He stared at the message. This town, fine, he typed back. Maeve's fine, getting her ready for bed. 3 dots. Then, the man in the corner booth. People are saying his name is Walter Odom, DOJ Public Integrity, like a big deal federal prosecutor, retired. Reuben read it twice. Then Maeve appeared in the hallway in pajamas, wanting to know if she could read for 20 more minutes, and he said yes, 20, and he put his phone face down on the counter. He didn't look up Walter Odom until she was asleep. What he found made him sit at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The county absorbed information the way old houses took on water, slowly at first, and then through every crack at once. By Wednesday morning, the story had moved through Millhaven in ways that had nothing to do with newspapers. Gus had mentioned it to 2 regulars. Becca had told her roommate. Someone who'd been in the diner that afternoon posted something oblique on the community Facebook page about witnessing something at a local restaurant. And the comments filled in the blanks that the post had been careful to leave open. The name Harmon appeared nowhere in it. It didn't need to. A man named Floyd Akers, who ran a small excavation company 3 miles outside of town, read the post over his morning coffee and felt a specific, familiar recognition. 6 years back, he'd lost a county contract to a development firm he'd never heard of. He'd looked the company up. It had existed for 7 months. Its registered agent shared an address with a Harmon family holding. He'd known it for 6 years. He'd never said it to anyone outside his kitchen, because saying it had always felt like standing in a field during a lightning storm holding a metal rod. He called a number from a Contractors Association newsletter, a tip line. His wife watched him do it and didn't say a word except, "It's about time." A retired building inspector named Hugh Fenwick read the same post and thought about the internal review. He'd been quietly reassigned away from 4 years earlier, 6 days after he'd flagged an irregularity in a commercial foundation pour on a Harmon development site. He'd signed a separation agreement because his wife was in treatment and there hadn't been a realistic alternative. He'd been carrying the paperwork in a file folder in his desk drawer for 4 years. He called a labor attorney he'd found 18 months ago and never worked up the courage to contact. Neither moment was dramatic. They happened in ordinary kitchens and in the front seats of parked trucks. They looked like nothing from the outside, but they were the kind of nothing that, added together, started to sound like something. The investigator who received Walter Odom's recorded statement was a woman named Sheila Brennan, 39 years old, at the state attorney's public integrity office. She had been, in another life, one of Odom's junior associates in the DOJ's Chicago Field Division. She knew what it meant when he used the phrase conditioned fear response. She had a file on the Harmon family's development dealings that had been sitting on her desk for 5 months. Suggestive, not conclusive. The contract patterns were consistent with corruption, but not provably so. She'd been waiting for a thread. By Thursday afternoon, she had placed calls to Floyd Acres and to a former county records clerk named Pam Voigt, who had relocated out of state 18 months earlier under circumstances that had caught Sheila's attention. Pam answered on the second ring. Her voice was the voice of someone who had been expecting a specific call for a long time and had prepared what she was going to say. "I saw the Facebook thing," Pam said. "I don't know why I'm telling you that first, but I did." "Take your time," Sheila said. Pam didn't need much time. She had been sorting this in her own head for 18 months, and it came out with the precision of someone who had rehearsed without knowing they were rehearsing. She described zoning applications processed out of sequence, approvals that preceded the standard review period, commissioner sign-offs that bore a signature she had been told was routine and had later understood was not. She described asking her supervisor a specific question about a specific application and the way that conversation had ended. She described her resignation package. "I have a daughter in middle school," Pam said. "I moved to a different state for her. I want her to understand that when you see something wrong, you have an obligation." A pause. "Does this do anything? What I'm telling you?" "It does," Sheila said. "I can't promise outcomes. But combined with what we already have, what you're describing is significant." Silence on the line. Then, "All right, let's go through it." Reuben Schafer's phone rang Thursday evening. Unknown number. He was in the kitchen, helping Maeve untangle a knot in a friendship bracelet while she narrated the diplomatic history of how the knot had come to exist. He answered. "Mr. Schafer," an older voice, unhurried, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent a career weighing words before releasing them. "My name is Walter Odom. I was at Petrakis Grill on Tuesday. Gus gave me your number." Reuben was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "I figured you might call. I wanted you to hear it from me directly. I filed a witness statement on Tuesday. I'm not able to tell you much more than that, but I wanted you to know that what I did came from what I observed, nothing else." Reuben leaned against the counter. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Maeve still working at the bracelet, head bent, not looking up, but he could tell from the angle of her that she was listening with one ear. "I also want to be honest with you," Walter continued. "The next few weeks may get loud. Your name may come up in the coverage because you were present. You have a right to know that before it happens. Will they need anything from me? Probably not. But if anyone contacts you claiming to be press or investigators, know who they are and what they're entitled to before you say a word." "Okay." A pause. "You handled yourself well on Tuesday. So did your daughter." Another pause, shorter. "Good night, Mr. Schafer." "Good night." He held the phone after the call ended. Through the doorway, Maeve had untangled the bracelet and was holding it up to the kitchen light with the satisfaction of a problem solved. He thought about what Walter had said. The next few weeks may get loud. He sat with what that meant for him, honestly, the way he'd learned to do since Annie died, because avoiding what you felt just meant it chose its own timing later. What he was afraid of was Maeve, not her safety. He was afraid of her understanding too early, too clearly, exactly how much of the ordinary world ran on fear of the right names. She was 10. She had time enough for that. He wanted to give her more of it. He went to the kitchen doorway. Get it sorted. She held up the bracelet. It required patience, she said, something he'd told her once about engine work, which she now deployed in various unrelated situations. That it does, he said. The story in the regional paper ran Friday morning. Terry Wachowski, who covered county government and had been doing so for 11 years, put it together with the patience of someone who had been watching for an opening and had just found one. The headline named the Harmon family. The subhead mentioned multiple witnesses and a pattern of contract irregularities spanning 7 years. Reuben's name appeared as a local business owner who had been present at the incident that had prompted the initial report. Nothing more. His phone buzzed 9 times before he finished his first cup of coffee. He made Maeve's breakfast. He drove her to school. He opened the garage at 8:30 because he had a transmission to look at, and someone was counting on it being done by afternoon. The familiar weight of a torque wrench in his hand, the smell of grease and old metal, the quiet of a space where he understood every sound. This was the life he'd built in 4 years, and it had more dignity in it than he'd sometimes given it credit for. Carol called at noon. Are you watching any of this? I'm rebuilding a transmission. Reuben. The county commissioner issued a statement. There's a state investigation. They're talking about Harmon development contracts going back to 2017. He lowered the wrench. I didn't do anything, Carol. A man made a phone call. That's what happened. You refused to move. I was sitting down eating lunch with my kid. That's the whole of it. His sister made the sound she made when she had strong opinions and had decided to apply them surgically. Most people in your position would be doing interviews right now. I know. You're not going to, are you? No. A long exhale. You're impossible. I know that, too. Lydia Harmon spent that Friday reading through 38 notifications in the parking garage beneath her office building. Her expression did everything she needed it to do, but when she called her father, his voice had a quality she'd only heard a handful of times. Not panic, not anger, but the specific controlled flatness of a man accounting for something he had not fully accounted for. Come to the house, Reuben Harmon said. Not the office, the house. He was 66 years old and had spent 30 of those years building the kind of local authority that didn't need to announce itself. He was waiting in the study when she arrived, and so was the family attorney, a man named Charles Pittman, who had the affect of someone paid to solve problems long enough that the nature of the problem had stopped mattering much. Walter Odom, Pittman said, without preamble, spent 28 years in the DOJ's Public Integrity Section. He filed a recorded statement Tuesday afternoon. He has been reviewing county zoning records independently. A pause. He called a former colleague at the state attorney's office. They have been building a file on your family's contract dealings for 5 months. They were waiting for a thread to pull. He closed his portfolio. We believe Tuesday provided that thread. Lydia was very still. That's one man's account of a table dispute. The state attorney's office confirmed receipt of 3 additional witness accounts this week. A contractor. A former building inspector, a county records clerk who relocated 18 months ago. Pittman's voice was perfectly even. What he signed was a separation agreement, not an immunity agreement. There is a difference. She looked at her father. He was looking at the window. She had watched him navigate 3 decades of politics and development and county relationships with the confidence of a man who believed the rules existed at a certain distance from him, a distance he had carefully, consistently maintained. He turned, and the thing she would think about for a long time afterward was that he didn't look defiant. He didn't look like a man preparing to manage the situation. He looked tired in the specific way that suggested the fatigue had been there for a while and he'd simply stopped concealing it. The things they're going to find, he said, are things that happened. I made choices over a lot of years, and I gave myself reasons for those choices. He stopped, started again differently. The money that was supposed to go to certain places didn't go there. The people those places were meant to serve needed it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. Lydia stared at him. In 34 years, she had never heard Reuben Harmon say anything that amounted to, I caused this. He was a man whose vocabulary had never included accountability in the first person. She didn't know what to do with the sentence, so she put it in the part of her mind that handled things she wasn't ready to examine. And she nodded, and she drove back to her apartment in the dark. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and thought about the canvas jacket, about the way she had looked at it, not even with deliberate contempt, just reflexively, the way she'd been taught to read certain signals as indicators of a person's weight in a room. She thought about the child's hands, which she hadn't seen but could reconstruct. Small, gripping something under the table, trying very hard not to let her face show what she was feeling. She had not thought of herself as cruel. She had thought of herself as direct. She was beginning to understand that those two things were not always different. The investigation expanded over the following 3 weeks in the methodical, unglamorous way that real investigations did. Sheila Brennan's team made contact with 8 additional witnesses. Some had been on their radar for months. Others came forward after the Friday story circulated, prompted by the community Facebook thread that had quietly continued growing, the way things did when people recognized something true in them. Floyd Acres' testimony about the lost contract opened a thread on competitive bidding records that turned out to be less complicated than corrupt systems usually were. It wasn't elegant. It was mostly a series of decisions made by people who had assumed they were safe. Contracts awarded without open bidding, companies with registered addresses that traced back 2 layers to a recognizable name, approvals issued before the statutory review period. The kind of corruption that worked not because it was sophisticated, but because everyone who might have stopped it had been given a quiet reason not to. Hugh Fenwick's account provided something they'd been missing: a direct link between the development permits and a specific documented action taken against someone who had asked a question. His separation paperwork bore the Harmon family attorney's signature. That detail mattered. The formal findings went to the state attorney's office on a Tuesday. Sheila noted the day privately, without being entirely sure why she noted it. Reuben Harmon cooperated in the specific controlled way that men who had spent careers controlling things cooperated when they understood the alternative. 2 of his associates were formally charged. He was not, though the record made clear his cooperation had been a factor. He withdrew from county business entirely. He was rarely seen in Millhaven after that. Lydia Harmon's name was in the public record as a person of interest. It would stay there. She spent the months that followed doing something she had never done in her life, staying quiet and sitting with the shape of who she'd been. She eventually found her way to a small organization in the county working on affordable housing access, the kind of work that had been systematically underfunded during the exact years her family's development interests had shaped zoning decisions. She didn't announce it. She showed up and asked what they needed. The director, a woman named Sandra Kwan, looked at her across a conference table with the expression of someone who had seen many things and was not naive about any of them. "I know who you are," Sandra said. "I know," Lydia said. "I'm not here to put my name on anything. I'm here because I know what's in those zoning files, and I know what they cost people, and I want to do something that isn't useless." Sandra studied her. "We need someone who understands the variance approval process from the inside. Our current volunteer is moving out of state. I can do that. It's not exciting work." "Good," Lydia said. On a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the story broke, Reuben Schafer walked into Petrakis Grill with Maeve, who had already decided on the coconut cream pie before they arrived. She was explaining something about a card game disagreement with her friend Dina as they came through the door, and Reuben was half listening and half noticing the thing Gus had put up near the entrance sometime in the past week. It was a piece of cardstock in a simple wooden frame. Gus's handwriting, large, careful, slightly uneven, the handwriting of a man who had learned English as a second language and still occasionally mixed up his capital letters. Something his father used to say, back in Greece before he'd come to America. A man's worth is not in what he owns, it is in what he refuses to give away. Reuben looked at it for a moment. Then Maeve pulled at his sleeve, and they went to their table. Gus came out of the kitchen, the way he always did on Saturdays when they came in. He stood at the end of the booth with his arms folded and didn't say much, because he never needed to. His standing there said what it said. Becca brought their drinks without being asked. Outside, Millhaven moved through its Saturday morning. People with places to be, and people with nowhere particular to be. The whole quiet machinery of ordinary life that didn't look like much from the outside, and contained, from the inside, everything that mattered. Maeve won the card game argument that afternoon, presenting what she described as documentary evidence that she had spent 3 days compiling. Reuben told her it was excellent research methodology. She made the face she made when she was simultaneously embarrassed and pleased. Annie would have laughed at that. He thought about her the way he'd learned to, warmly, without gripping too hard, knowing the memory stayed whether he held it or not. He drank his coffee before it went cold. The pie was good, and the afternoon was ordinary, and that was the whole of what it needed to be.